Hi, everyone. Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to get started. My name is Natalie Bell. I'm the curator at the List Center at MIT, and we're honored and really grateful to be co-hosting tonight's program with Contemporary Art Center Cincinnati. This evening is the 5th of 8 sessions that are organized and convened by Shifter, which is a journal co-edited by Avi Alpert and Rit Premnath. The List's partnership with the CIC came about because both of us are preparing exhibitions with Rit Premnath for next year. So on behalf of both of us, both institutions, I just want to welcome anyone who's attending or joining us tonight who is new to us or to CIC, and invite you to visit us on our websites or on social media. And for those of you who are new to Shifter, a little bit about Shifter. It is an issue-based journal that occupies a pretty interesting space where art, contemporary art, and experimental writing and critical theory come together. Each journal issue typically results from a series of public dialogues on a particular subject. And in this case, that subject is waiting. Shifter was founded in 2004 by Rit, and it's co-edited by Rit and Avi. And they will introduce tonight's series and speakers. And before I pass it off to them, I just want to mention that we are recording these sessions, and you can see any of the previous sessions in the Shifter series on the List Center's YouTube and also on the CAC's YouTube. So thank you again, and I'll pass it off to Rit.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session of Shifter Waiting. Thank you so much to Natalie and Emily and Nick from MIT for hosting and organizing this session. And thank you to Amara, Antilla, and the team at CAC for hosting us as well. Waiting is a subject that's been on many of our minds, I think, as we continue to struggle through the pandemic and await a vaccine. Maybe there's an end in sight. But when Avi, Alpert, and I started to think about this subject in relation to Shifter, we wanted to think about the many modalities of waiting through the thinking and the art and the writing of all of these people that we've invited, ranging from enforced waiting, the waiting that of incarceration, chronic waiting, which entire groups of people are forced through, natural waiting, perhaps waiting that could be thought about outside an anthropocentric lens, and of course this sort of more existential waiting that all of us are doing all the time, a kind of refocusing on waiting not as something that we are trying to avoid, but rather as our primary occupation, but also thinking about waiting potentially as something desirable, something that we might want to pay more attention to. And I'm super excited that Margarita and Diego today will be presenting their research and thinking around waiting, which and all of this will unfold into a publication to be launched in the fall of 2021. And I want to remind everyone that we are excited to hear your voices through the Q&A function in Zoom. So as you have thoughts and questions, please put them into that, and Avi and I will moderate a discussion and read those out to our two presenters today. And I will pass the baton to Avi, who will introduce the speakers today.
Thanks, Rit. Hi, everyone. So yeah, we'll go, I'll do quick introductions. Margarita and Diego will speak for about 10 minutes each. And then we'll invite them to respond to each other. Maybe Rit or I will ask a few questions as things gather in the chat, just so you have a sense of the time and the format. I'm just gonna read the bios. And I'll read Diego's first because he will speak second, and I'll read Margarita's second because she will go first. So Diego Gerard is a writer, editor, and translator. He is the co-founding editor of Disonare. His fiction, translations, interviews, and other writings have appeared in the Brooklyn Rail, the River Rail, Terremoto, and Boiler House Press, among others. His book, Waiting for More Than One, with John of the Thing Press, will be published next year, 2021. And he lives in Mexico City. Margarita Sánchez Urdaneta is an artist, writer, and educator. Her work investigates how systems, historical accounts, and fictional narratives sanction and permission lawful and unlawful violence. Margarita holds an MFA from Parsons, the New School, a graduate degree in journalism from the Universidad de los Andes, and was a fellow at the Independent Study Program of the Whitney Museum of American Art and Soma Summer. Her work has been featured at several international venues, including the Kitchen, the Elizabeth Foundation for the Arts, Museo del Barrio, the BID, Museo de Arte Contemporáneo de Bogotá, Galería Gabriela Mistral. Great. Okay, so thanks so much, Margarita and Diego, for being here, and I'll turn it over to Margarita for her presentation.
Hi, thank you, Emily, Natalie, Rit, Abby, and Diego, and also to Nick for helping us set up. So today I'm gonna today I'm gonna talk about a project that's fairly recent, but it has roots in research and other projects that I've been developing for almost 10 years. For some time now, I have been interested in accounts and narratives of sanction and permission, lawful and unlawful violence. In previous works, I've concentrated on how accounts and for disappearances, mass graves, and terror tactics are obtained and framed by journalists, government officials, and even groups that act outside of the law, but that sustain a social contract within their ranks. And from that, I developed a project that had to do a lot of like the politics around mourning, death, and the disposal of bodies, and thus how that would sustain violence. Today, I would like to focus more on like the anticipation of a sentence or on unlawful pronouncement. So I'm gonna talk a little bit both in terms of like legal frameworks and frameworks that make sense outside of the law, or like social agreements that function as sort of the law outside of the frameworks of a government. In these two anticipated sentences, both lawful and unlawful, the system creates like a time lapse that ultimately provides a scene of violence. Using Adriana Caballero's term horrorism to navigate these moments both of terror and horror, I aim to understand the model in which the act of waiting becomes an intrinsic part of a form of violence that surpasses death itself, and how language needs to be reviewed in order to address, represent, and grasp contemporary forms of violence. So the project as a whole is a film with a print component that would be, in this case, in Shifter. So I'm gonna sort of start articulating these ideas through mapping time. For the project, I would like to focus on how the anticipation of a legal sentence is to be expected to in instances of narrative, fiction, nonfiction, and parafiction, and how it's performed ultimately produces this narrative that validates the judgments and moves from the process of like a judgment that surpasses subjective conditions in favor of intersubjective ones. So first I divided the presentation in sort of sections. So the first one is a unit. I picked this poem by Polly Chase because it starts articulating some of the questions that I've had in terms of like time, narrative, and agency. Thinking of the sentence both as a syntactic unit and the pronouncement that stipulates a punishment, and how this function as a unit, a structure, and a verb deploys or sets in motion what it's, for some, is a scene of justifiable violence. A sentence, a present participle, advances a plot, it unleashes a punishment and imposes a scene of horror. In some cases, the sentence has been imposed before the hearing, as if those who pronounce the sentence have the power of foresight, or that of the omniscient narrator. An insight on the punishment that will unveil in time, cases that involve inconsistency plea bargain negotiations that also point to biases, or extrajudicial executions that carry this narrative orders. So to think about through the framework of Carrero and how she's thinking that this term horrorism is not just the end of human life, but the end of the human condition itself, in particularly vulnerable bodies, associating this question of this sentence as both a judicial decision and the linguistic unit. So John Bender does this connection creates this connection quite well by talking about the rise of penitentiaries and how I'm going to read the section. The sentence was a judicial decision on guilt versus innocence, or it was a determination of punishment, both absolute, instantaneous pronouncement that referred themselves and their objects of judgment to principles outside of time. But linguistically, the sentence unfolds in time like a plot, and its elements have grammatical role play, narratives that are made of such sentences. And then he starts touching upon this question of the novel, which I think for me, it's quite interesting, thinking both in terms of legal documents and documents that function outside of the law, like let's say accounts or essays by people that have been either incarcerated or have been victims of a sentence that functions outside of the law. The liminal prison became the penitentiary when through a conflation of the legal and the grammatical notions of a sentence, randomness gave way to a narrative order, and sentences came to be served rather than executed. For me here, there's a really interesting point in terms of the question of execution and serving a sentence. Because serving a sentence is quite tied to the legal system and the penitentiary, while the execution of a sentence still functions in terms of what happens outside of the law. And I'm going to talk about a particular case later on. This is an essay by William Blake called "A Sentence Worse Than Death." And in this case, the judge talked about, like, you deserve an eternity in hell. For me, this start articulating a lot of things in terms of sententious speech, how that is quite tied to history of dramatic writing, and how that sententious speech for me is gonna become like a point of mapping, an important point of mapping in terms of the timeline in the sentences, on the process of sentencing. And then William Blake, who's been incarcerated at this point around like 32 years in solitary confinement, starts talking about the moment of inflection that was produced in the moment of his, not just in the moment of his sentencing, but with this sententious speech that the judge claimed at that point. So now I want to talk about this question of time. And it relates to this expectation of punishment in relation to approaching death, and how that becomes the ultimate punishment, to like sustain that moment of approaching rather than just like the end of like an execution in a way that becomes cuts all types of punishment. So for that, I started mapping out this particular a set of cases. And in these cases, for me, they had to have certain particularities in terms of both the sentencing, the case, the allocution, and how there was like a sonic type of torture in the moment of sentencing or the moment of like being incarcerated, in the case, for example, of William Blake. So I started mapping out for moments of allocution, where unlike in the US, in a lot of states, allocution becomes, it's a right, and that can deter a sentence, not the conviction, but the sentence. So the moment of allocution, the moments of sentencing and appeals, moments where a sound component was quite specific. And so in terms of, for example, the narrations that William Blake is discussing, he talks about how being in solitary confinement becomes sort of this soundscape of other prisoners that are adjacent to him, and that becomes sort of a moment of horror. He doesn't use the word horror, but it kind of touches upon the level of violence that it's produced there. And the second case that I'm going to present today is a case of an extrajudicial sentencing, which was the Salado massacre in 2000 in Colombia. So as I map questions, points of allocution, so for example, A would be determining a moment of allocution, and B would be a moment of sentencing. But in this case, because there's so many actors and it's very hard to map out who is speaking, it's all based on account of survivals, things start to get diluted, and there is a concentration that's of the accounts and the allocutions in a different manner. So based on this type of mapping, I developed this system or like this way of thinking through time, and how in the cases that are touching up, for example, in case of solitary confinement, rather than they rely also on the time of the legal space. So they're highly all the sentencing guidelines, everything is recorded. There's a paper trail, there's a reliance on court documents, there's a pronouncement of the sentence and a way of enforcing it. There's an allocution that, like I said, is sort of a legal requirement. And then the realization that for the sonic things like sonic torture are function within the legal realm. And also in terms of like sonic disturbances between prisoners, that is also functions within the legal space. So I crafted this maps that are thinking through how time is compressed or expanded, and how these points of accounts, allocutions, or processes of sentencing create different ideas of like how the time is compressed in those particular narratives, and therefore like how horror or terror is produced in specific time frames. For the case, for example, of the Salado massacre, this became more like the model I wanted to use in terms of like multiple sets of timelines that kind of are stringed together, since the execution rather than and there's an execution of the sentence rather than a sentence being served. The timeline becomes compressed, so it's a shorter timeline. In this case, it was a massacre that lasted 2 weeks. So most of the accounts are compressed in that time, and a lot of the execution of the sentencing, which was, again, it's like very hard to point where the sentencing is, becomes diluted, because there is no one is pronouncing like you are sentenced for this and this. But the sentencing is sort of abstract, or it's in the everyday language of like how perpetrators, in this case, paramilitary groups, are talking amongst themselves and deciding who they are going to kill in that particular moment. In this case, it was like the whole town was defined as being complacent with guerrilla groups. Therefore, the whole town was sentenced to sort of disappear. So around 60 people were assassinated. So this maps again continue to like overlap different time frames between one single event, and how that event has been highly redacted. So there's a lot of holes in those narrations, and how the narrations start to sort of break from each other and end up tying themselves in based on on how the record of time and the record of those moments of sentencing are articulated in later on legal documents. I want to touch upon this question of the craft and silence. So the moment in which there's a sonic sentencing and a linguistic sentence. So I've been looking a lot through this visual vocalization expression, and also taking an interest in questions about paralingual interpretation, which is already quite interesting to a default mode, because besides of focusing on this like temporal and territorial concentration of the sentence, it kind of fails to interpret the moment of the sentencing, since there's no sound recording there's no document that we can sort of map out to visual vocalization. So anything done through this method would be a fiction, and it enters again into this realm of like trying to recreate or rethink the event. So I keep thinking of different moments of allocution, and then sort of a contrasting moment between the timeline design and the timeline of the particular event or a particular person, and the sort of sonic landscape that is embedded in that timeline. And finally, thinking through this question of allocution and sonic agency, I think for me, this is the moment where the project itself is thinking, it sort of gives a turn, thinking also as the allocution as a moment in which we can rely, or not rely, but in which the account or the narrative becomes more poignant, where there is a sort of pushback against the sentencing process, or the definition of the sentence, and there is a removal of ambiguity, and that's where I think that the concept of disambiguation for me starts to act. So again, another way of mapping out time in a way in which the capital A functions as what the actual event was, and the lowercase A in this case becomes what wasn't, but what was possible. So I'm mapping out possible allocutions that would sort of counteract the overall arching narrative of the actual event. And how it branches out to the point where it becomes almost like circular time and is thinking through itself with all this sort of possibilities of sonic agency. All of this is, of course, focused on what happens in the way of we're narrating this particular crimes, and also this particular way of sentencing. But I think it's a way of focusing on this account rather than in the moment of the production of horror, but the moment in which like horror is paused for a second, where the allocution of the person who's being sentenced sort of grounds things in reality, in the reality of the horror and the terror that's actually happening to a living, breathing human, and not like sort of the annulment of the subject that Gerard is talking about. So that's I'm gonna wrap it there. Maybe I'll just read the last part. Thus, I wonder if indeed a sentence, an allocution produced outside of the system that produces the sentence, can generate a sort of temporary Lazarus syndrome, a lapse in the narration of violence, the terror, and the horror. And in this allocution relies the pragmatics of trust and the violence that has been perpetrated. So that's sort of where my project is at.
Thank you, Margarita. Diego, whenever you're ready.
Hello, everyone. First of all, I want to thank Rita, Navi, and everybody involved with Shifter. This has been an amazing ride so far, investigating weighting from so many different points of view. So I want to thank you for the format and for the content and everything else. I want to thank Margarita as well, whose presentation I think is going to give me a lot of, it will serve as a visual aid for everyone who's watching for some of the subjects I'll be speaking about. So if I just share my screen here. So I'm going to talk about weighting in terms of forced disappearance in the drug war in Mexico, which is a crisis that's ongoing, but that has also lasted a long time. So I titled this presentation, Weighting, Violence, and Mythical Time. I'm going to start you off with a brief history of violence in Mexico, and it's also sort of a bit of a selective account of time as well. So 1910 to 1920, we have the Mexican Revolution, which cost so many lives, immediately followed by the Cristero War. And I really wanted to touch upon these because that's the main subjects Juan Rulfo in Padre Páramo speaks of. So he, his most famous ghost story and arguably the best ghost story of all time is based upon the dead people of the Mexican Revolution and the Cristero War. So as you can see there, I also, I put the date of that book's publication, Pedro Páramo, in 1955, preceded by Waiting for Godot, which is a book that I'm intervening just to showcase the cases of waiting in terms of the forced disappearance in the Mexican drug war. A little further forward, we have the publication of 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, which you can just regard as a bit of a parenthesis there because it'll just be relevant in terms of a personal story. Moving a year forward, we have the student massacre at Tlatelolco, which was a student protest out of the National University, which were very violently clamped down by the government in place and the military. Right after that, we get the the first big account of the Mexican drug war as we know it today. So in 1978, the Guadalajara Cartel is founded, and that sparks the beginning of a massive operation which transports drugs not only from Mexico and across the border to the USA, but also from South America to Mexico, and just providing a very complex chain of production for consumerism of drugs in America. Another bit of a parenthesis here, the year of my birth, 1984. I've included this just because I wanted to make the point that I was born into a paradigm of the drug war. I mean, the drug war started before I was born and it's ongoing now, so it's the main paradigm within which I've existed. And then in 1989, we have how the Guadalajara Cartel breaks down into many cartels. So that's, but what this creates is just a massive input of violence. So as the big cartel breaks down, you get many different cartels across the border and across the country, which are now competing against each other. It's important to say that the Guadalajara Cartel was a big monopoly of drug distribution. a bit further forward and parallel to the international trade agreement between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, we have the insurgents of the Zapatistas in Chiapas. And then a bit further forward, we have the opening of the drug war as we know it now. So President Felipe Calderón in 2006 openly declares war on drug cartels. And what happens here is we get a lot of violence on the streets, a lot of violence in the media as well, and we're just having a daily recount of dead bodies and forced disappearances in the country. As you can see here in 2014, we have the very sad case, which I think is the most iconic in Mexico's recent history about forced disappearances, which is the kidnapping and possible murder of 43 docent students from Ayotzinapa, who were on their way to a protest and were intercepted by local, federal, of the police forces, and also by the military. So that's the biggest case we have today, and which has dominated the news ever since it occurred. So, and this is the slogan that came upon the murder and disappearance of the students. It says, "Vivos se los llevaron, vivos los queremos," which roughly translates to, "Alive they were taken, alive we want them back." And I wanted to really include this here just because, to my eyes, it has a bit of a surrealist tint, and it also has a bit of a hint of magical realist language. No, I mean, we know the students were murdered, but yet again, we're demanding them back alive. I wanted to give you also a bit of numbers, grim numbers, just to illustrate the problem and also how it's been widely documented in the last years, ever since Felipe Calderón declared the war on drugs. So from 1964 to 2020, we have a little over 73,000 people officially reported as disappeared. But a big number of those come from 2006 to 2020. So more than 90% of those. And finally, from 2006 to 2020, almost 4,000 mass graves have been found, of which 6,625 bodies have been exhumed. I'm going to shift a little here to speak again about my own personal paradigm. I already spoke about how my whole lifetime has been encompassed by the drug war in Mexico, but I also want to offer a bit of a family story and a personal sort of paradigm that has been informing my work a lot. So the book here, you can see, is 100 Years of Solitude. In the 1970s, my father traveled to South America and became in contact with this book while he was there, while he was reading in Colombia, which in turn led him to visit what Gabriel Garcia Marquez calls Macondo, and which led to my father giving me a middle name that repeats at least 20 times in the book. I mean, 20 different characters have this middle name of mine, which I'm reticent to divulge right here. But what I'm going with this is this leads me to my own personal investigation of magical realism, a little bit as an obsession, but also to put aside Cien Años de Soledad and focus on the work of Juan Rulfo, which is the best magical realist writer that has come from Mexico. Through his work, I find finally the lens with which I see and experience my country. And one of the basic elements of his work here is the deployment of mythical time. So what happens with mythical time as opposed to linear time is it's exactly this: the linear workings of time shatter, and we enter into a temporal ambiguity, which is often described as circular time, but not only that. I think what he's getting into is the idea that time can be unstable, it can shift, it can rearrange, and it can swing back. You know? So And the idea that this sparks is the return of the dead. So that's why we have Juan Rulfo's ghost stories. So we have here, through his body of work, we have temporal ambiguity, the dead come back to life. Through the deployment of mythical time, their voices are heard and no longer forsaken by history. It's an ode to all those lost through our history of violence. And his work best tells the story of those we continue to lose every day, even long after his death in 1986. Rulfo's ghosts are the people history forgot and whose lives have not been recorded. The scene we have here is a still from the film La Fórmula Secreta by filmmaker Rubén Gámez. The text for the film was written by Juan Rulfo, and I think the film best captures this message of the dead voices of Mexico, because he has the character speaking directly to the screen, and I can almost see the 43 students who were murdered almost speaking to me directly from the camera. So we arrived to one of the few questions that I want to put forth to the audience, which is if magical realism can help the process of mourning. And I'm talking about this more collectively than realistically and more symbolically as well. So is a deep and rooted belief able to help in the process of mourning in the actual lives of the people who have lost people to the drug war? So after reading Rulfo and really rereading Rulfo and coming into the maelstrom that is his work, I started thinking of how even to this date, Juan Rulfo's work is the work that best describes the situation we're going through even now. So I started to think, I was writing at the time a novel that tried to discuss forced disappearances in Mexico through magical realism, but I was finding that I was failing to do so, just because Rulfo was already saying that in a better way that I could ever do it. So I started thinking in terms of appropriation. This is a quote that was told to me by Paul Chan when I interviewed him, and he told me the longing for the new is a reminder of what should be renewed. So this immediately took me to analyze the problem of forced disappearances in Mexico through works of appropriation. And this led me directly to Waiting for Godot. With this investigation of Waiting for Godot, I was trying to focus more on the collateral victims of the war rather than the people who disappeared. By this, I mean the families who have to wait for their loved ones to arrive or have to wait for a body to be exhumed to set off the process of mourning. We have here, so forced disappearances force the act of waiting, mass graves force the act of waiting, unrecorded deaths force the act of waiting, parents wait for their children to return, parents wait for the help of the authorities, waiting becomes existential, enforced, possibly chronic. This takes me to another question I want to put forth to the audience, which is, can the absurd be utilized as an effective political rhetoric or as a political message? This brings me to the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Diego and Margarita. I have so many thoughts and responses, but I'm maybe first open it up to Margarita if you have any thoughts or responses to Diego.
Yeah, it's very interesting to see all the points that are intersecting, and also thinking through the impact that literature has played in the sort of conversation and the way this disappearances in, I don't want to say Latin America in general, but Mexico and Colombia, and how they've been framed and sort of memorialized in this literature, but also how the literature itself is thinking the problem of time. Both Garcia Marquez and Juan Rulfo will touch upon it, and like generations that come after the magic realism are also gonna think about it. Also thinking, for example, Boño's conversation between the savage detectives and Amuleto, or Los Ejércitos de Evelyn José Rosero, are gonna think about this time and the moment of the sort of the carnage, but at the same time waiting in a receded space for that carnage to cease to or to pass. So I'm really interested in this question of like, or I would pose to Diego this question of like how sort of embedding a personal narrative within like the history or like this framework of this very, very heavy Latin American tradition of narrating is how he's articulating in as a way of like how we as a generation are thinking time, thinking as like the Magic Reels writers were thinking of time in this sort of circular way. There's like a subsequent generations of writers, and your generation, how your generation or our generation is thinking of time, and that those two specific moments in literature.
Yeah, I was gonna say how I was struck by how similar the second project you were talking about, the case in Colombia, of the sentencing in Colombia, how it resembles almost to the bone the novel by Garcia Marquez, Chronicle of a Death Foretold. You know, it's really impressive, and I think our generation struggles to understand linear time. I mean, circular time, because linear time is the way in which our current paradigm works, and it's really hard to experience circular time in the way these authors used to see it, only because of the way we are programmed now. You know, even through the use of technology and such things.
One of the things that struck me, of course, was the way in which Margarita's spirals became a way to think linear and circular time together, and create these sorts of compressions of space-time. They're both sort of these sonic waves in a way, these sound waves, but they also can be read as maps in a sense, I thought. And also the final diagram you had, Margarita, which looked to me like branches or like cracks in a surface. And kind of one of the things that I'm curious about for both of you, I think with you, Margarita, there seems to be in this sort of thinking of horrorism, there's a kind of impasse. There isn't really like an escape in a way, or I was not able to perceive it like a kind of escape from waiting. So the speech act that this allocution that you call it has a kind of complete power and control over the life of the person who is sentenced. Whereas when I think about your presentation, Diego, and thinking about both the figure of the ghost and the use of, I won't say circular time, but a use of a non-linear time as a way to find other ways out of the trap of linearity. And I'm interested in thinking these two different relations to time, I think, in your presentations.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that I've been thinking in terms of allocution, and the reason I sort of try to think of the presentation as notes on disambiguation, was because I also thought that for a second, allocution could, the allocution that's provided by that person who's being sentenced could provide a sense of, or a notion of, or would attach itself to disambiguation, which is sort of a clarifying moment. That I'm still thinking through it, and it might kind of pair up with what Diego was talking about, the ghost, which is like the moment, and in that case, like when you're reading an allocution from, for example, a massacre, in that point, the distance in terms of time of the narration already speaking of a ghost. So I think there is an interesting parallel, and that's why I was at the end trying to sort of evocate the image of Lazarus in terms of the allocation as something that comes out of the space of death. So there, I might have not articulated at the end, but I think there is like a pairing in what Diego was sort of thinking through.
I was very struck, Margarita, as well by when you mentioned that waiting is worse than death itself. You know? So this also sparks an analysis that can be driven through linear time, but also through circular time. Because I mean, when I think about the victims who have lost children to the drug war here, and how their everyday life now revolves around going out to find them, you know, there's sort of a circularity there, in the sense of how their lives, their days are the same one after the next, you know, even and this is only a result of the absence of the body they're looking for.
I thought, as we're waiting, if anyone again would like to join in, feel free. But as you guys are both presenting and speaking, so I think I've gone blurry here. 1 second. As you were both speaking, I was thinking about this idea of like a life sentence, or you know what it means that in effect, right? We all have life sentences. We all have a certain amount of time that our lives will extend for. That is, we don't know. It's indeterminate. And I think one of the things that makes capital punishment or imprisonment in general, or the kinds of atrocities that you're talking about, so horrifying is this, you know, given the kind of worldview in which we only have one life sentence, we only have one kind of life to live out, to take that away, right? To take it away for violence or for greed or you know, the impunity of a state is so damaging. And so this is a way also, Diego, of trying to answer or offer something of an answer to the provocative questions you're posing about, you know, where does the role of absurdity or kind of magical, realistic worldview, that in some ways, in a world in which we have no choice but to be condemned to these kinds of sentences, and I took this to be some of the work you guys are doing, sentences that in fact, we don't get to live out the lives that we would like to write for ourselves, but we live in lives that are written for us. It is one of the powers of art, of literature, to try to imagine, to create the space. And maybe I took this something from your map, Margarita, of the potential, the possibilities of other lives that we could live that we don't necessarily get to live. And I don't know, I mean, my question for you almost in reverse, Diego, would be, I don't know how to live otherwise. Like, is there a way in which we wouldn't have some kind of magic or relationship to what didn't happen, what could have happened, what might have happened? You know, can we stay sane without these kind of extra paths or possibilities? If we have, I mean, at least I have, you know, this kind of one life worldview, I wouldn't know how to do that without the imagination, without art, without these kind of other articulations out there. All right, that's maybe less of question, but a kind of response that I was thinking as you guys were talking, and that I really appreciated in your presentations.
Unless
I agree. I just wanted to say, living in a country where the belief of the magical is so deeply entrenched. I mean, we have Day of the Dead here, which is a celebration that really evokes circular time. I don't know if you've heard, but we had a really deadly earthquake in 1985, which struck on September 19th, and then 32 years later, on the same day, we had another deadly earthquake of the same magnitude. So, I mean, our understanding of life in Mexico allows for a certain magic and a certain allowance of circular time as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think responding to the conversation, I keep also thinking, because since I've been researching also the legal system in the US, this question of like overlapping life sentences, like you're sentenced to 10 plus life sentences, and that fulfillment ties in a very different manner in the way that how Diego was talking about it, and how 100 Years of Solitude is tackling that sort of, not to be sort of tautological, but that sentence of like living one's life over and over again, and are not feeling like there is another way of living that life. So I think like the projection in terms of temporal ambiguities becomes only, there's only refuge of those temporal ambiguities in a sense that a space that functions parallel to the moment of living. Sort of thinking also how sort of is gonna touch upon the question of the event, but it also kind of distances itself when you're thinking about like literature in Latin America because of the way of magical realism, or like how magical realism sort of determine how we're living through time.
And thinking of both Beckett and I often think about, of course, Kafka's Trial. I don't think for them absurdity was a kind of abstraction of the real. I think it was very much a representation of how the world really is. And so I think in a world that's absurd, magical realism as a way of is a way of extending, in a way, the absurdity that's already present, I think.
Yeah, when I started writing this project of Waiting for More Than One, which is actually a direct translation of every single line in the play into the context of the Mexican disappearances. The absurdity that I was trying to point out as well was the absurdity of how these people who look for their children who have disappeared, the absurdity of not having help by the authorities, you know, how, and they're looking for sense, but they're also looking for help, and it's something that's not arriving as much as sense isn't arriving to you know, to go in the play, you know. So.
Yeah, maybe in relation to that, I wanted to ask both of you about this. Well, this word that Margarita, you brought up in your presentation, which is anticipation. And of course, like waiting, I mean, you're speaking about this sort of circularity, which is maybe I think of in relation to repetition. But anticipation, I think, occurs even in the lives of those who are condemned to death. I heard this, well, to paraphrase, I guess, what a detainee in one of these migrant camps said. He said, "I prefer the certainty of deportation to the uncertainty of hope." And I found it incredibly sad and moving. But again, it was this sort of, that this being forced to wait is a form of suffering that that has no end, in a way. And I'm curious if that idea of anticipation could be fleshed out some more.
Yeah, it is. I think as it is so painful. I mean, also I think something that I didn't mention maybe about the El Salado case, which anyone who is sort of familiar with massacres in Colombia, this is one of like a fundamental case. It's because one, it lasted 2 weeks, and two, for me, in terms of like sonic space, the perpetrators created a level of anticipation that sort of overpowered any sentence, because they decided to play instruments and play music as they were killing people, as they were like, and they designed sort of this games. So in that sense, like the anticipation of not only who's gonna get killed, but the horror you're gonna be exposed, even if you survive, surpasses any kind of hope. So I think when we're talking about how some of my sort of timelines look like cracks, it's also, I think also there's like this sort of the circularity at the same time is killing that sense of hope. It's like the hoping, or not hoping, but the acknowledgement and the anticipation of the following massacre, or of the following disappearance, or the following moment of terror. And in the case of, for example, solitary confinement, it's the anticipation of the horror of, and in the soundscape of other prisoners that are next to you, that are also going through this process, and people are screaming, people are committing suicide. So the anticipation is already kind of laid out in terms of like a narrative, or like the narrative is already embedded with the anticipation that horror is yet to occur again. So I think for me, anticipation is still like a term to think through in terms of, for example, what the escape could be, even if it is an escape of anticipation itself. I don't know if I made sense at the end.
I don't know. Sorry, I don't know if you wanted to follow on that.
Yeah, I wanted to actually bring it to Diego as well, because I found that quote that you read out, this I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember it, but we want them back, and we want them back alive. This sort of desire for the impossible, which is both, it's a way of not letting go, right? It's this kind of refusal to mourn, but a kind of desire to stay with the melancholy of that loss. And so again, there's this anticipation, I think, that operates within there, which is the anticipation of a return that might never happen.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's the anticipation of a return, which we might label as maybe something that's impossible, of them coming back alive. But there's also, other than being a very effective rhetoric, there's also the anticipation of finding a body, right? So there's this thing, I think it's Freud and Mourning and Melancholy, where he says that when you don't find a body, mourning splits in two, right? So there's half of the self which starts the process of mourning, and then there's half of the self which is still attached to the possibility of a return. So the anticipation here might be just mourning, the chance to be mourning at last.
We're sort of approaching 6:30. I know we started a few minutes late, so if anyone hasn't put in a question, feel free. I think part of what's so difficult about engaging with your presentations, at least for me, is I think a lot of what we thought about with this waiting series was how do we articulate these layers of, I get annoyed, when I'm waiting for someone to respond to an important email, versus like we're talking about the people in prison, versus talking about refugees, versus talking about the kind of waiting to find a dead child, or kind of waiting in a torture. And it's how do we hold these different registers of waiting together? And I think your presentations really, really brought out the depth of that difficulty. As we're sort of thinking about, how are we waiting, and what does the world look like in waiting? And what are the extreme difficulties of the possibilities of that situation? And I noticed, Diego, you put your same birth year as mine and Margarita's, I believe, 1984, in your presentation. But I don't. It's not to ask your personal story, but it's sort of interesting to think about, how do we relate to these worlds around us that maybe are very personal for you. Again, I don't know, but in other times are, for me at least, are trying to understand a world that I don't necessarily experience immediately, but I know is produced in some way. The conditions which makes my life somewhat easy are related to these. It's not independent of me. Especially these kind of Cold War dramas. So, I'm curious if you had thoughts on, how do you relate your personal story? Is it just to sort of say like, okay, here's a mark in time, here's where I fit in here? Or is this in some ways connected to you in other modes in the work? Again, not to pry in a sense, but kind of how you're processing it. And we also, if you don't like that question, there's also a question in the Q&A that I can put on the table as well, and then maybe, because also we're out of time. And this is from Oscar. He says hi and thanks for both presentations. And the question is there a space for reparation in your projects? And if so, what would it look like?
Okay, I would say when we talk about reparations, one of the main reasons why I embarked upon trying to analyze the stories of the collateral victims as opposed to the direct victims. When I say that, I mean the mothers and fathers of those who have disappeared, is because I think that the narrative we've been told in the media about them has been very unfair. So one of the aims of this is to really restore humanity to them as well, and not just think of them and pity them as victims. I mean, their daily lives allow for laughter, allow for happiness as well. It's not only searching for their dead children. I don't know if that responds to that, but that's the aim.
It's interesting because in one of the projects I developed a couple of years ago, I was also sort of using or working through accounts of women that were looking for the bodies of their family members in the rivers. And for me, it's been very touch and go in terms of like how reparations function, especially because, for example, in the case of Colombia, we've had multiple failed attempts for reparations. And in this process of finding and excavating these narratives or these histories of particular massacres, or overall the history of a very painful subject, I think even just having the possibility of producing a different, or thinking through what the accounts are or how the accounts are framed, and how those texts are written in particular, for me, it starts like to engage in a conversation that can function parallel to policy, but it can sometimes even move faster than policy. And it's what, at the distance sometimes, from the distance of like, not just in time and space, but like the distance of not being, have lived, like incarnating that level of horror, is a way of thinking of like how we're narrating, not just to each other, but like structuring those conversations, especially thinking like this conversation about literature. You can see a lot of the accounts, or like how government officials are almost writing literature in those reports. But where is that? Is that literature pointing at? Because it's not the literature that, for example, like Julia Kristeva is going to touch upon. There is kind of like a gap between sort of what texts are being produced and that narrative is being produced by government officials in terms of reparations, and what is happening, for example, in the case of like artists or people who are thinking or writing fiction.
Maybe we can take one last question before wrapping things up. And Lucia asks, how do you think that waiting can become an act of resistance? And if so, do you think it would operate, how do you think it would operate in the social context of Mexico?
I would answer that an act of resistance in waiting in Mexico is just stand by side with those who actually have to wait, and really elevate their voices. There we can really take waiting as resistance, because if not, I mean, I don't know where we're at.
Thank you, Diego. Any last thoughts, Margarita?
Thank you for a really interesting discussion, especially this thinking of time, not just like waiting, but how time develops within waiting in parallel spaces. And thank you, Diego, for a really interesting like connection in terms of our histories of violence.
Thank you both. I'll read one last comment from Sophia Casarin. She says, thank you all for this. This has made me think about the idea of anticipation in relation to Diego's presentation and waiting within the crisis of disappearances in Mexico. A question, a comment would be in relation to the others, not those waiting for their children to come back or waiting for help from the authorities, but the anticipation and waiting for everyone else that lives within the paradigm in which we're always anticipating the possibility of disappearance. And I think that's a nice note to end on, where she really pulls those two layers apart, the metaphysical aspect of waiting and the real reality and difficulty of waiting. So with that, thank you both so much. I'm sure there are many more questions and a lot more to unravel. I want to remind everyone who's here that our next event with Matthew Metzger and Jane Norris is on January 28th. So please put that on your calendars and come back for the next Shifter session. So thank you so much, Diego and Margarita.
Thank you, Avi. Thank you, Reed. Thank you, Margarita.
Thank you.
Thank you.